Okay, we have heard the news. We've got this class action lawsuit and now a settlement with the National Association of Realtors. I'm gonna be real honest with you. There's a lot of misconceptions that are out there in the headlines. So in this week's video, I'm gonna break down what's been settled, what hasn't been approved yet, but is probably going to be approved come the summertime, and how that's going to affect both buyers and sellers nationwide. This is not just in the state of Texas. Because this was with the National Association of Realtors, it's going to affect everybody. So stick around. Hey everyone, my name is Danae Hewitt and I'm your go-to DFW realtor here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. I help people buy and sell houses all across the Metroplex, and on my channel you're going to get a lot of tips and advice on how to do so. Well, let's get into this lawsuit. So there were some sellers that didn't understand or didn't know, whatever, that they were paying the buyer's agent and their listing agent when they went to sell the house. And a whole lawsuit happened, a whole settlement happened, and that went to court, and they filed a lawsuit, it went to court, and the National Association has agreed to settle out of court, and nothing has been signed, sealed, delivered by the judge yet, but here is what the settlement did include. So one misconception with the lawsuit is that the seller is only paying one commission. They are paying that commission to the listing broker, the agent that they have hired to sell their house. They are paying them a percentage to do that. And what that broker decides is if they are going to share what they have received from the seller with the cooperating buyer's agent for bringing them a ready, willing, and able buyer. They have worked together successfully to close the house. So sellers, they're only paying one commission. It's the broker that decides if they're going to split that with another agent. And that has always been the case. Always been the case. Now, I don't know about other states' listing agreements because I'm only licensed in the state of Texas, but in our Texas listing agreement, when I go and meet with a potential seller client, that compensation is clearly outlined in two different paragraphs. The first paragraph is the total percentage that the seller is going to pay that brokerage. All right. And then a couple of paragraphs later, it's going to outline if the broker is going to split it with an MLS participant agent. And if they do agree to split it, what that percentage is going to be given to them. So it's outlined in a couple different paragraphs. So when this lawsuit first came out, I was like, well, it's stated in the agreement. One percentage is paid to this brokerage. This brokerage decides if they're going to split it with another agent. And one reason why that has to be discussed up front is because here in the state of Texas, we do not have what's called dual agency. Dual agency is when one agent, I am representing, giving advice, giving knowledge, giving information to both the seller and to the buyer. That does not exist. That is illegal in the state of Texas. What we do have in the state of Texas is something called intermediary, and that has to be written and given notice to all parties involved that I, as the broker, I am going to just be the middleman in terms of negotiations. If I was originally working with the listing agent and a buyer didn't have an agent and they just said, hey, I'm just going to use you to help me with this transaction. That's what's called intermediary. I'll be real honest with you. I don't love intermediary for a couple of reasons. One thing is that when I've met with a seller, I've obviously established a rapport with them, an understanding with them, and and all of that. And then the buyer, they're most likely maybe they're finding me on social media, maybe they are just calling off of the sign and they don't have an agent. I really recommend that they do get their own agent, just because that means I'm like, human resources of when I'm intermediary. I can't give any advice. If my seller says, well, hey, do you think they'll come up any higher? I'm going to be like, can't tell you that. Just because I am also speaking with the buyer. I can't relay any information, and I've already established rapport with the listing agent. So Anyways, that's just me personally. There are lots of agents that are okay with intermediary, but me personally, it's just something I would love to refer out to another agent. Let's talk about these changes that most likely will be happening, and they say sometime in July. We don't have a specific date, but sometime in July. The first thing is that buyer agent compensation will no longer be listed in the MLS. Currently, as it stands right now, if I am looking at houses for a buyer client, I go into the MLS, there's a little area right there that tells me what percentage that broker is willing to split with me if we get this contract to the closing table with my client. So I know that up front. Now, that cannot be in there come July. That will not be in there. As a listing agent, there can be no mention of it. We have something called the transaction desk where documents are uploaded that go with the house, like the seller's disclosure and the survey and things like that. I can't even write it in a Word document and upload it. I mean, like, there can be zero mention of it. That's the first change. The other change, and this is going to be a big one because not a lot of agents do this, is that they now have to have a written buyer agency agreement with a buyer before they go and see any houses. All right, let's unpack this for a little bit. This buyer agency contract outlines my duties and responsibilities to you, and it explains the relationship between you as the buyer and me as the broker. And what it does is it gives clarification around the services you can expect, and it offers transparency around buyer agent compensation. Something that I don't think consumers might know, I mean, some do obviously, but that real estate agents, we work on contingency. Contingent that a home sells, that's when I will be paid either as a buyer's agent or as a listing agent. We don't work on retainer like attorneys work on retainer. We work on contingency in the hopes that we can get you to the closing table. So this buyer agency agreement is going to outline all of that stuff. And we have to make sure that that conversation has already been had before we go and look at houses. Now, there are some states that already mandate it, like you have to have that buyer agency agreement signed and filled out and discussed before you go and see houses. Here in the state of Texas, that's not an agreement that we have to have before we go and show houses. Now, let me say, there are some brokerages, there are some teams that absolutely, that is a rule. You have to have this agency agreement signed before we even go and check out houses. All right, now me. I will be honest with you, that's not something I did right off the bat for a couple of reasons. First thing is that I wanted to get to know you to make sure that yes, you definitely do want to work with me, but also that I want to make sure that I want to work with you too, because this is a two-way street. One thing I've done with potential clients is if I said, hey, let's go and see some houses, let's get you pre-approved, and then we can go into a buyer agency agreement so that we both know and that are comfortable that we want to work together, our personalities mesh, things like that. So me personally, that's what I've done. And there are a lot of agents that have done that. There are some agents that don't even use the buyer agency agreement. So that is now a big change, and it's going to be a big shift in our market, but I think it's actually going to be for the better because it's really going to guarantee that agents are having these conversations with clients so clients know exactly what they're getting into when they go to buy a house because they've signed off on it. So those are the two big changes. There are some others, but those are the two that I'm going to talk about in this video. So let's talk about compensation in that buyer agency agreement. There is a paragraph that outlines that the buyer broker would be receiving X% from the sale of the house. Now that is something that can be negotiated between the buyer and the broker. Now what we used to do with that is that I could go into the MLS to see how much compensation that broker was going to be splitting with me, and hopefully those two numbers matched. Okay, hopefully they did. But this agreement has always been in place that if those two numbers don't match, then that buyer in the agreement, they might be responsible for paying that difference, but that's a conversation between you and your agent. So what does this mean for both buyers and for sellers? So for buyers, You need to have that conversation with your agent and know approximately how much money you're going to need, not only for your down payment, but also for your closing costs, and now potentially paying your agent's commission if for some reason that broker is not going to be splitting any commissions with you. All right? That's going to be a big chunk of change. At a minimum, an FHA buyer, your down payment's going to be 3.5%. Closing costs are anywhere from 3 to 5% of the sales price of the house. And then there could be buyer agency compensation on top of that. So we're talking thousands of dollars just with down payment and closing costs, and then to add this on top of it. Now, if you're a VA buyer, currently, the VA does state that you cannot pay any buyer agency compensation. And this is where I feel like this settlement is just such a disservice to our veterans, because legally they cannot pay any compensation to their agent. Okay, but what if they like a house and that broker is not agreeing to split any compensation with the agent? Then what happens with those veterans? So that absolutely has to be figured out, but I'm not going to figure that on this video. So buyers, once we kind of know what your finances look like, you're going to have that conversation with your agent. You're going to have to tell your agent, if you can only say, all I have is a down payment and closing costs. All right, I don't have the money to pay for your compensation as well. But this doesn't mean that you're not going to have representation because you can't pay for their compensation. So just hang with me, I will get there. As an agent, what I'm going to do is, if there are homes that you would like to see, I'm going to have to do a little bit more legwork to find out if there is compensation on this end from the broker, which means I'm going to have to make some phone calls. I'm going to have to send some text messages because, again, it can't be listed in the MLS. So it's just a little bit more legwork for me. But then what I do is I go back to you and I say, hey, this is what the broker is willing to split with me. This house matches what we have in our agreement. This house does too, this house, but these houses don't. So then you let me know at that point which houses you would like to continue and go and see. And if it's not the ones where the compensation is an even match, then you just let me know and we won't go see that house. Now for sellers, when you go and work with a listing agent, your commission to them has always been negotiable. Always, always, always. I mean, commissions have always been negotiable. What this means for sellers is that you can still pay your listing agent the amount that is standard in your market. You can still pay that, and that broker can still split it with the buyer's agent. 100%, that can still happen. If it's something that you are simply refusing to do, then that's a conversation you're going to have with your agent. And that agent's going to be telling you some of the effects that we might see happen. We haven't seen it yet, but we might see happen. You might get fewer showings on your house. You might be weeding out a large section of buyers if they're VA buyers, if they're FHA first-time home buyers who typically don't have a lot of money towards a house anyways. So that's a conversation that you are absolutely going to have with your agent to make the best decision for you and for everyone going forward. Now I'm talking to my buyers right now. One thing that could happen is, let's say there is a house that you want to go see, but the buyer agency compensation, does not line up. There is a gap. We could still go see that house. And what we can do is put in, if you like it, once we put an offer in, we can find out what that difference is, and we can still ask the seller to pay for it in the form of concessions. Seller concessions are something that's a paragraph. It's already written in our contract and is used, just about all the time. This is money that the seller is going to give the buyer at closing. And right now, typically we see that for helping towards closing costs, for repairs that the seller just doesn't want to do. And they're going to say, hey, let me just give you X number of dollars. So you as the buyer, you can go take care of those repairs when the home is yours. Or it can be to buy down interest rates right now. But it also might be concessions now to give your agent that difference if those two numbers just don't match up. So it doesn't mean that the house that you want to go see is totally out. We can try to negotiate that into the contract if it's a house that you were dying to see and really hoping that there was going to be compensation for it. Now, on the flip side, if you are selling your home and you do receive an offer that is asking for seller concessions, don't be surprised. It might be because this buyer, maybe they are a VA buyer and they can't pay their agent, but they're asking you to pay their agent because legally they can't do it. So don't be surprised if you see that inside the offer. When this settlement actually is signed, sealed, and delivered, there is definitely going to be some growing pains. Absolutely. But just like with any change in the real estate market, there's growing pains and we adapt and we move on. And I absolutely see that that's what's going to happen. I'm not worried about it. I think there's going to be a higher standard and a higher accountability for agents when they are working with both their sellers and their buyers. And I am here for it. Totally here for it, and I think it's a great thing. I'm all about accountability and making sure that everybody understands every part of the process when they are buying and selling a house. What did you think about this information that I gave you? I would love to know in the comments below. And if you're looking for an agent here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, please let me know. I would love to be of assistance. My contact info is in the description below. All right, I'll see you next week.